be a workshop. We're going to actually move a little bit into small groups. Don't get nervous about that. We'll make it work in this room, even though we don't have round tables. But I want it to be as practical as possible, as did JCPA, in focusing on something that we haven't, I don't think, heard a single session that hasn't alluded to the polarization within our community and the growing and the broader society, and how it affects all of us. And this workshop is specifically on tools that we can utilize to navigate in a polarized environment, including tools around civil discourse, around consensus building, and the like. The polarized environment is here for the foreseeable future. We all know that. So the question then is, how do we do the work that we are passionate about in that environment? And that's what I hope we'll be able to walk away with some very tangible tools with this afternoon. So I'm going to jump in by starting to talking about what I think is at stake around the issues of polarization in our community. I then want to have us do some brief scenario-based exercises. We have a great panel with Bob Kaplan and Stephanie Hausner, and then we're going to walk through very quickly a set of tools that we have found to be useful in mitigating the kind of polarization that we've all dealt with. So it's meaty, and I think it's urgent. I was talking to a colleague earlier today, and we were talking about a period in our careers where we would go through periods of slow paced kind of moments, and then everything would be revved up and it would be crisis central. But then you would have a break again. There is no break anymore. It's all crisis central and with deep, passionate feelings on multiple sides of issues. That's the environment we're in. So growing polarization is a fact. It's not at the margins of our community, but increasingly affecting our entire system, including lay and professional leadership. It's found, by the way, not just in traditionally broad-tent institutions such as Hillel's and JCRC's and JCC's, where we first saw it, but in synagogues, day school communities, federation board meetings, predominantly Jewish golf clubs. You name a Jewish institution, and there's likely to be polarization. Now, there are many causes that we all know for the breakdown in civility. Polarization on Israel, the sense that the center has been squeezed out, and political realities in Israel that are dramatically at odds with where a majority of American Jews are. A loss of self-confidence that often makes the most extreme voices louder. The internet and the social media and the way in which telephone tag is played today. Mega donors' influence on political campaigns that then gets carried on into the kind of influence that these same mega donors want to have within our own community. There are so many causes for the breakdown of civility. But the bottom line is that the cracks in the dam have been growing. The Iran deal exposed how the cracks are eroding community unity, and now the dam, which has been held as a result of a common understanding of communal interests combined with nuanced leadership, is bursting. I'm an optimist, and we haven't come close to hitting bottom. Israeli government policies, Muslim registry, American embassy, Supreme Court nominations, refugee status, women at the wall, healthcare, immigration, school vouchers. These are just a few of the flashpoints that are at our doorsteps. And so many of these issues are regarded as existential by the passionate adherents of various viewpoints. So my goal in our time together is to share the tools that I believe that we can use in navigating these turbulent waters well. We can't eliminate polarization, but we can navigate in these waters well and engage a broad range of community leaders in repairing the dam and keeping it strong. I want to focus on what's at stake for the Jewish community, so let me first assert several key points. Number one, our community is not immune from the breakdown of civility in the broader society, nor the echo chambers that lead people to reach the point of tuning out anything than their own perspectives. By the way, I hear that even now with regard to anti-Semitism. I hear folks who have been focused sometimes on anti-Semitism from the far left to want to be dismissive of anti-Semitism on the far right. And I've heard folks who are primarily concerned about anti-Semitism on the far right be dismissive about anti-Semitism on the far left. That's how deep the polarization can run now. Secondly, because discussing Jewish communal polarization often means acknowledging that Israel is no longer the unifier for American Jews, we tend to be slow to recognize how deep the chasm is. Thirdly, there are two kinds of communities, impacted and pre-impacted communities. None will be immune, though the left-right balance and the specific flashpoints will differ significantly depending upon the community. New York and San Francisco are very different in terms of the political composition, religious composition of the Jewish communities, but we're often dealing with similar kinds of challenges, though the momentum may come more from one segment than the other. Similarly, all of our communities, you know, whether we're big or small, we come from an independent JCRC, a small JCRC, a national organization, a local JCRC organization, a red state, a blue state, a purple state, something else state. We're all in this together, experiencing this. In addition to the foreseen issues, by the way, I mentioned, there are even more unforeseen issues where we will experience potential pressure points and major communal divisions. Also, there's no silver bullet when it comes to managing divergent perspectives, but a range of strategies, starting with civil discourse training, which can help, all related to the idea that there's no one size fits all. So in presenting a range of tools today, the idea is to say it's a toolkit. Some of these may be helpful to community X or institution Y, and some others may be less helpful. It depends on where you are, what the nature of the issue is, which are the tools that might be helpful in addressing these issues. The stakes, by the way, are significant with respect to the level of polarization that we're all experiencing. I'll just mention a few. It can affect the welcoming culture within our Jewish institutions. It can destroy human relationships. It can interfere with the focus and time on and time devoted to the key issues or the key mission of the organization. For example, you know the amount of discussion that's taken place over the last few months over how often, not how often we should or should not issue statements, but the amount of time that gets committed to having the arguments over whether to issue a statement on X or Y is absolutely tremendous, let alone then the pushback after you've issued that statement. So it can interfere dramatically with the amount of focus that you should be able to spend on your core mission. It can lead people to pick up their marbles and walk away. It can demoralize staff and lay leaders. I can't emphasize that enough. You know, if I have one message to folks who are in lay roles, it's please be cognizant of what the impact, the wear and tear that this environment can have on staff who are managing in this kind of environment on a consistent basis, and lay leaders themselves often are bruised and bloodied as a result of the polarization we feel. It can eliminate the sense of safe space in a broad tent. And one of the roles that I see JCPA and CRCs playing that's critical is to maintain that broad tent for our community so that it doesn't collapse. And it can discourage younger Jews from engaging, who look in, see the polarization, and at the end of the day say, who needs this, and walk away from it. Those are just a few of the things that we have at stake here. So I approach this not just as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to harness our communal energy, to develop tools to help, and to build a community leadership equipped to move forward in a polarized era. And everything we do this afternoon is intended to serve as a community building tool in this climate. I want to make clear one thing, and that is that much of this effort to address polarization necessarily requires focusing on civil discourse. But JCPA and JCRCs, for JCPA and JCRC specifically, civil discourse is not an end in and of itself. It is a means to an end, because we are ultimately policy-making organizations. So if I were to draw a distinction, I would say that civil discourse is aimed at making it possible to hear, fully hear, somebody who may have a sharply different view from yourself, and to be able to hear that with respect and empathy, but not to try to change that view. That's not the goal of civil discourse. Where it may happen that as a result of building a relationship, somebody's view ultimately shifts, but that's not the goal. But the goal of consensus building is to find out where that common ground is and ultimately develop consensus as a means toward achieving a policy end. In order to develop consensus, civil discourse is necessary. And in fact, I describe our bodies as exemplars of civil discourse. It's one of the unique roles that we play, but to understand that they are slightly different but related ideas, I think is very, very important. Now, one of the tools that I think is essential is to draw on the wealth of Jewish texts that we have that talk about civility and civil discourse and how we treat each other in environments that could be tense. And all of you should have in your folders the packet for this workshop, which is called Tools for Moving Your Community Relations Agenda Forward in a Polarized Environment. If you turn to the first page, you will see a set of texts that I particularly like that are drawn from the that I excerpted from the Jewish Dialogue Project Guidebook, which you can download online, Dialogue in the Jewish Tradition. And I would love it if somebody would be willing to read just the first excerpt, which is from the Babylonian Talmud. Many of you will be familiar with it. For some of you, it may be fresh. But who would like to read it? A volunteer, please, Lori.
You want the first paragraph?
The first two paragraphs.
For 3 years, there was a dispute between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, the former asserting the law is in agreement with our views, and the latter contending the law is in agreement with our views. Then a voice from heaven announced, those and those both are the words of the living God, that the law is in agreement with the rulings of the school of Hillel. Since, however, both are the words of the living God, what was it that entitled the school of Hillel to have the law fixed according to their ruling? Because they were kindly and modest, they taught their own rulings as well as those of the school of Shammai. And even more, they taught the rulings of the school of Shammai before their own. This should teach you that one who humbles himself is exalted by the Holy One, and one who exalts oneself is humbled by the Holy One.
Thank you, Lori. So what do you learn? What does somebody think we learned from this? Please.
Well, apparently, Hillel, although God said we will go follow the laws of Hillel or the position of Hillel, Hillel went one step further and said it's important that we know what the school of Shammai had to offer. And therefore, as I said, they introduced it first, and then they discussed it first, and they understood it, and then they went to the school of Hillel, where they saw the nuances, because the nuances made it possible for the Jewish community to go forward.
And I think that's excellent. And one way I think to also look at that, therefore, is that the ultimate result is stronger by being willing to hear not only your own views, but the views of others that you might disagree with. Any other thoughts about what strikes you about this teaching? How many of you have never heard this one before? Anybody? Maybe I didn't ask that the right way. How many of you have heard this before? Okay, most. Okay, what else strikes you about this? Please. Humility. Okay, great. And that's hugely important. And as I said before, when everybody's passionate about something, along with that passion comes that sense of I'm right. And therefore, the humility doesn't necessarily show up. So how you can be passionately open is really one of the challenges here, I think. Other insights here. Please.
Not necessarily agreeing, but respecting the opinions of others.
Okay, great. Did you hear that? Not necessarily agreeing, but respecting the opinion of others. Anything else? I'll tell you what struck me most about this is that nowhere does it say that the law follows Hillel because Hillel was right. The school of Hillel was right. It doesn't say that. It follows the school of Hillel because of the humility and because of putting the teachings of Shammai even before the teachings of Hillel. And I thought that was really a powerful lesson in terms of what civility means within Jewish tradition. Let's read one more, the bottom one, which may be less familiar, but I think is a fun one. Who would like to read the one on the very bottom from the Be'er HaGolah in the 16th century? Rabbi Judah Low of Prague, the Maharal, please.
One should not reject anything that contradicts the view. This holds especially true for an interlocutor who does not intend to provoke, but to honestly declare his beliefs. Even if these are counter to our beliefs in our religion, it is not proper to say to him, "Speak not, say nothing." For by doing so, there will result no clarification of religious beliefs. On the contrary, one should say, "Speak up as much as you wish." For if one prevents the other from speaking, he thereby reveals the weakness of one's own religious position. Such is the proper manner in which to establish the truth, to hear their arguments which they hold truthfully and not merely to provoke. Therefore, it is not right to dismiss the words of one's opponent, but to draw him close and look carefully into his words.
Thank you. Any comments on this one? Yeah, Neil.
So the fact is it could really be a wonderful mission statement for JCPA. Because what we were created to be and what we have to continue to create ourselves to be is a place where religious and political opinions are all heard, and that we all listen to what other people are saying. And being the one room in this Jewish community where that can happen is a unique and positive challenge for us, because that's what we were created to be. And the question is, are we doing that? And how well are we doing that?
Good. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Please.
I've always found in negotiation that the other person will listen to you if he or she is convinced that you have listened to them. And that's exactly what I think is happening here, that it's too easy to immediately say what we think and why they think is wrong without saying, no, I'm listening to you, I understand what you're saying. Maybe even ask for clarification, and then.
Good.
I think it's very good.
Excellent. Thank you. Please.
The reality is, to build upon that, very rarely do we listen to that. We pretend to. We give it a lot of lip service. We go through our emotions of listening to the other. We very rarely open our minds enough, go back to the previous Gemara, to have the humbleness and the ability to listen and lend dignity to the other's narrative, the same amount of dignity that you would lend to your own narrative. And by doing that, I think you're absolutely right. The other person is no longer taking away their dignity, we instilled it in them, and then it opens a possibility of communication between people.
Okay, great.
Just to add to that, I mean, I note the word look carefully into his words. I think it's not important enough, it's not enough to simply listen. It's important to understand where someone's coming from, and that takes work. And once you do, it will help you listen.
Okay, great. And please.
So I think the term active listening, is something that we sometimes use with my colleagues and staff. You know, the ability of not just nodding your head and being respectful to the person, but actually internalizing the person's argument. Literally, there's all these techniques where you don't speak what the other person is speaking. You ask one clarifying question, and I think that originally when I first learned about that, I was sort of concluded that I don't try this. But the reality is it's turned out to be a very, very useful tool. Because once somebody feels you've listened to them, whatever the issue, once you've validated them, and they're forced to be validated by asking a question, you have to listen, otherwise you can't compose the question. I think it really lowered the temperature. I think a lot of polarizing issues into a sphere of calmness and rational debate versus heated discussion.
Great. Please, last one.
Just that his goal was to establish the truth, it's not to go on the argument.
Great. And in fact, for me, and all of these are excellent comments, the line that strikes me the most is when it says, for if one prevents the other from speaking, he thereby reveals the weakness of one's own religious position. In other words, what's the worst that can happen from listening to another view? The worst that can happen is maybe they will, in fact, persuade you a little bit to move. But if not, then what it will do is strengthen your own position. By hearing the other viewpoints, you end up at least strengthening your own and maybe even being moved a little bit in another direction. By the way, I think particularly for JCPA and people talking about what could be JCPA's theme in a way, I have to go back up one to the other one, also from the Mishnah. So moving to the third one on the page. Why do we record the non-accepted opinions of the schools of Hillel and Shammai to teach future generations that one need not demand that only one's own way is correct, for our forebears did not do so? Why then do we record the minority opinion of one as opposed to the majority opinion of all the rest, given that the majority decides, so that a future court might have reference to them and rule thereby? In other words, future generations will lose out if we don't somehow collect kind of the fullest picture of what the legislative history, what the debate is. And if all you're showing is kind of a narrow slice, it's not going to be so useful or informative for future groups that are going to be looking at it. I thought, there's always been this discussion in JCPA and JCRCs, do you record dissenting opinions? Do you not? We have an elaborate approach to that in San Francisco, by which if we reach a certain threshold, we do record dissenting opinions. And JCPA historically recorded dissenting opinions, but I thought that was really a remarkable piece that addresses that. So tool number one from my vantage point is to simply take cognizance of what the stakes are and talk about them. As I started out doing today, what are the consequences of what a polarized environment's impact means for the Jewish community? The Jewish Funders Network recently became so alarmed by the degree of polarization that they issued a profound document called, I think it's called Funders in Power. I can't remember the name of it, but if you Google Jewish Funders Network, Funders in Power, but it's basically a manifesto of proper behavior of philanthropists in their partnership with Jewish organizations as it relates to avoiding polarization, because they were so concerned about what was happening in the environment. So number one is to take stock of and articulate what's at stake in a polarized environment, because not everybody fully appreciates it. For me, tool number two is to draw upon our sources. In our own communities, bring these kinds of texts. There are others, of course, that you could draw on as well. I just happened to sort of try to get them all on one page. But to utilize texts that speak to why we have to change the way, the tone in which we address our passionate ideological viewpoints on whatever the set of issues is, if we're going to advance our cause as a community, and let everyone know that what the stakes are if we don't do that. So these sources, I think, can be very valuable. Now, I want to move on to a little session, but it's going to require some logistics. So here's how I think we're going to do it, and I just need everybody's quick cooperation too. If you look in your packets, you will see that we have a set of scenarios, and there are 5 of them. And the fact of the matter is, much of the polarization that we're all dealing with comes from, and particularly in recent times, is the reality of being bombarded to take a position on X or Y, and somebody saying, unless you take a position on X, we're going to walk, or we're going, walk either, economically or physically or whatever it is, or we're going to undermine your institution, and somebody on the other side saying the absolute opposite. And there's so many issues on which we are being bombarded to take those positions today. We heard a little bit of the strain around Iran from David Harris, but Iran was only kind of the sort of a watershed moment. But since then, since something that happened on November 8th, I can't remember exactly what it was, we've been bombarded a few more hundreds of times to take a position on this, that, or the other thing. And the reality is that in many of our communities, at least, we've been dealing with polarized situations for some time. So I developed a set of scenarios that are going to seem like, oh God, this will never happen, except I think you'll know that every single piece of it is drawn from reality. And it's showing, I hope, the complexity of how hard it is to navigate in these kinds of polarized situations. So we have 5, and here's what I'm going to ask to do. We'll have 20 minutes in groups, and each group should have somebody who will say, I'll facilitate, and somebody else who will say, I'll record, and then we'll have each group very briefly say, what you came up with as ways to navigate through these scenarios. The way I put it is, what are the factors to consider and how do you respond? One of them deals with the Muslim registry and a lot more. One is a sort of how big is the tent question. One, and a related one, where are the boundaries? One, a passage of the Kotel law, and one, a response to a white nationalist march, which is the latest one that I've added.